Hello and welcome to the Trauma Resonance Resilience podcast. And my name's Lisa Cherry and I'm going to be your host today. And it's been ages since I did a podcast and I'm so sorry, but there's been like a pandemic and there's been like my PhD and there's been like all these different things that have been going on that have meant that actually recording podcasts has been trickier. So that is why I am excited. And I always start my podcast with, I'm really excited to introduce, but I am really excited to introduce to you someone today. So this person was born in the same year as me. So we share a year. They also have had a long career in journalism, and my the person, I don't know, but my fantasy job was Kate Silverton. So there's something really exciting for me around that. This person has wooed the nation dancing, which by anyone's standards is, well, I mean, I couldn't even do a Zumba class, so I'm very impressed with that. She has a psychology degree from Durham, but previously to going into journalism, and is a mum of two, and is also the author of There's No Such Thing as Naughty. Please welcome Kate Silverton.
Yay, hello. How are you?
I'm good. It is so good to have you on here. There are like so many touch points that it's going to be a job to stay really focused. And it's just so nice to have you here. So, God, where do we begin? Can we start with just dancing, menopause, and journalism? Should we just do like all of those three?
I knew it. I thought she's going to go in on that. Yes, I'm very happy to go in on that. What's your question on that one?
Well, okay, so I was thinking about, because you've had your children what might be considered a little later, and so I think your eldest is 10, is that right?
She is 10 tomorrow, which I don't know when you're going to be broadcasting this, but yes, it's her birthday.
So you're kind of in that whole peri and beyond, having young children. I mean,
I am.
Even work like in your?
It's a very good question, and I'll give you a really potted history, because there was a very interesting conversation that came about when I'm just trying to think if I can relay it correctly. But essentially, I was sat in front of a very eminent gynecologist, and without going straight into it, but that's what we all do, that's what we should be doing, and I just remember saying to him, when we were talking about the potential for me to have, I've only got one ovary, I only had one ovary, and the potential for the other one to be removed, and so he was taking my history. And it was sort of started off with, yes, in my 20s, I had this, terrible twisted cyst that nearly cost me my life. And I lost my ovary and fallopian tube. And then in my 30s, I tried and failed, 5 times with IVF, but many more times, prior to that with miscarriage and the usual things that so many people that have tried and found it difficult to conceive will have faced. And so there was all of that heartache. So that was in the 30s, and you could see him sort of nodding and thinking, right, oh dear, so this poor lady is now presenting to me in her late 40s, and we're talking about taking the other ovary. So he sort of went to go on to that, thinking, well, that was it, because obviously in her 30s she got to 40 and hadn't conceived, and had all this heartache and physical stuff going on. And then I said, but then hang on, I did fall pregnant naturally at the age of 41 and 43, and then I had 2 more pregnancies within that time. And he just looked at me going, right, so we're now talking about HRT in the same decade that you've had 2 children naturally, conceived naturally. And I could tell he was even thinking, because the doctors had essentially, at the age of 40 said it's not going to happen. And on my wedding day, my husband and I, having had so many struggles to get there, we said, no, we'd made our peace, and we just said, we want children in our life one way or another. We will think about fostering, adoption. We started applying for our criminal checks and everything. And a few weeks later, I was sat in the makeup room and just saying, gosh, I just felt really swollen. And my makeup lady looked at me, and Jenny, and, and everyone knew what I'd been through. So everyone was sort of walking on eggshells, but she just said, do you think you could be? And I was like, no, of course not. Come on now. I'm, 40 and, gosh, no. Anyway, sort of went back home, thought about it, thinking, well, it is quite odd. I do feel quite odd. And then went to the gym, and my husband was working abroad, and I took 2 tests with me, and both of which came back, and I did the digital ones, both of which came back saying you are more than 8 weeks pregnant. So that was the journey since then, but that was it. Yeah. So,
and I wonder if, because I've heard that story many times, and I wonder if there's something about the body and where we are on a cellular level when there's a process of acceptance. You'd got to that place where you'd gone, okay, this isn't meant to be, and then you fell pregnant naturally. I mean, I've literally heard that story so many times.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things to that. One, I completely concur. I think one always is quite careful, because knowing how heartbreaking it is, it's there's that element of, oh, just relax and you'll be fine. And if you're in the middle of that, you want to just go F off, just really, you don't know. There's a resistance to that. But I can say this hand on heart, that I would not have fallen pregnant and had the journey that we've had, I don't think, for me, without accepting that loss. And I was only able to do that with psychotherapy, actually, and with my wonderful, who became a very close friend and sadly recently died, but I paid tribute to her on Instagram, and saying, because the reason why I mention this is because she taught me how to lose. And anyone working in psychotherapy or in psychotherapeutic services will understand what I mean when I say that, is that when we hold on, or I should talk from the I was so held on to this idea of having children, and this fight, internal fight. And I was going off to Afghanistan, and I was going off to Iraq, and I was going and jabbing myself with the IVF, things when I was doing big corporate events and sitting next to Princess Anne. And you just kind of go, how, when I look back, and my husband even said, it's like, how did we ever think that was going to work? And of course, we have to have a look at the mind body as one. Western medicine hasn't taught us that, but this is what it is. So if my body, and that's what I write about in the book, if what goes on in the brain doesn't stay in the brain, if we are so consumed by stress and tight, clinchy buttocked, as my friend Cleo Rockers used to call it, but if we are that tight and wound up, then our bodies are going to respond accordingly, because we're in that sort of chronic fight or flight state, that chronic stress that is so unhealthy. And we're constantly pushing ourselves. There's no space to just sit and be. And I think that's where I think it comes back to your point of, when we've accepted that it's not going to happen, yes, there's a grieving that comes with that, as it should do, but actually it allows the body just to come back to a place of space and acceptance. And then, now look, at 41 and 43, with an egg count of practically -0, -1, whatever, it was below, it was sort of 0.7, basically. If anyone's ever done their AMH, which is the anti-Müllerian hormone, which tells you how many eggs you've got, I was, it should be up there in the sort of 20s to the 40s, and mine was 0.7. So there is something remarkable about it, and I did at the time, and still think it's something of a miracle. But I do think there's a huge element of understanding that we could get to, where we understand how the body and brain works, which brings us back, as I'm sure we will, understanding why our children behave the way they do and how we can best help them. So thank you, because it's a really good, I haven't thought about it like that before, but that's really what I would say, that me at the age of 40, was having a full body experience. And once I was able to let that go, with the help of a psychotherapist and with the help of my husband on our wedding day, saying, we will get to the point that we want to be at, but we need to have acceptance first. And then, hey presto, 8 weeks later, I'm pregnant.
There's so much in there around loss, and also so much in there about where we might be at different points in our life when we're having children, and just thinking about that kind of soaking in cortisol and what that might have looked like had you managed to get pregnant while you were racing around the world in very complex areas where you were in your fight, flight, freeze mode because you were needing to survive in those spaces. And it's very straightforward in many ways when we have this knowledge and this wisdom to look back across our parenting journey. So my children are 22 and 25. And what kind of pregnancies we had and what that looks like and how that's manifested. And that's really difficult, actually, because there are things that happen and ways of living and ways of being that we are not likely to understand the outcome of until our children have transitioned into adulthood. And that's really hard because we can't go back. If you think of I had my first child at 26, my second child at 29. I'm now 51 and a half. And I would be a very, very different parent. Not in the love and the nurture and all of that, but actually in, God, show me a parent who wouldn't look back and go, if I'd only known how short this time was. If I'd only understood. And sometimes I think if I would give my life to just have a day back then. And we don't necessarily have those type of conversations in safe ways. And there was something else that I think came across. We'll get into your book, actually, because it's a beautiful segue into your book. Some of the things that you do to try and help people understand the science is you show those areas of experience that we are uncomfortable about. There's one passage where you talk about being observed by a friend and the pressure to behave in a certain way, to act in a certain way, to parent in a certain way. And I think you'd hurt your foot or something. You'd hurt your foot. And I just thought, these are the things that are really difficult. How do we stay in our strength in the face of really quite conflicting messages? And if we don't have that parenting guidance, we don't have the intergenerational beautifulness of a mother before and a grandmother before in our presence, where do we go? And you've added to that body, I guess. And I don't want to answer your question really, but I guess my question in that context would be, was that your why?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I've been working with a number of charities. I've been meeting with a lot of parents, parents who'd fostered, parents who'd adopted children, parents whose children were in educational centres because they'd been excluded from school, parents who hadn't seen their children for years in one case, but had been reunited, her having gone on a wonderful, wonderful course to help her. She'd had to leave the home due to domestic violence. Her son was then put in care and had terrible experiences, and bringing them back together and then nurturing them both. So you can imagine the richness of the conversations that I was having. And some of the psychiatrists and psychoanalysts, there's a really very eminent Professor Peter Fonagy that I reference in the book. And we were having a big sort of roundtable discussion one day about the sort of the acute services that they provided. And I just said, well, how can I help? And I can come in and I can sort of shine a spotlight as a journalist, and I can pitch for programs so we can highlight this incredible work that you're doing. And he sort of stabbed a finger at me. I spoke to him this week, actually, we were laughing, and he said, it's your responsibility to capture and help and get this message out to this. And I'm holding my hands out wide now, because he said, we can reach a certain number of parents. He said, but everybody's in this position. Everyone's just trying to do their best. And we live in a time that is so conflicted. I mean, one of the psychiatrists said he believes that the downfall, the nuclear family, he said, is the downfall of Western civilization. And what he meant by that was exactly what you've just been referring to, that we've lost that wonderful sort of it takes a village to raise a child, that community sense of support. And all of that got me thinking, and the parents were saying to me, write a book that remember, we're not all scientists. We get it now because we've had this incredible help and support, but you need to write a book that every parent can read. And they didn't mean that in a derogatory way, because they were just saying, look, you can sit and read all the academic papers you like, but if it doesn't resonate. So there was this big, not responsibility, but a responsibility on myself to write something that was accessible, because I get excited by science. I get excited by research. I'm a London cab driver's daughter, so I don't come from this sort of highfalutin sort of academic family, but my dad had a thirst for knowledge, and he retrained and went into hypnotherapy, actually. And, so I always was never afraid to ask questions, because he always used to encourage me, like, if you don't know, if it's them, they're not explaining it properly, Kate. And so, there was this sense that actually, if I've got to write something that someone's going to get, that's on me to do that. If someone doesn't get my book, it means that I've failed to convey the message. So there was this massive science and this incredible, wonderful science that we now know that can help us to understand our children's brains, and how the stress response works, and how all of that drives their behavior. And also this very sort of, I say obvious, it's this, I kind of wish that these scientists had talked about it earlier, but as they kept saying to me, yeah, but we talk in big words. But anyway, this sense that the brain develops in a sort of hierarchical fashion. So we can't expect a 3-year-old to have the same brain as us. It's not as developed yet. So I thought, how can I explain all this? And bringing it back to that point about that sort of sense of judgment that we all feel, and the sort of the guilt and shame that is so pernicious, but that we all go back to, because that stems into our own childhood experience very often. And I wanted to take all of that away. And when Professor Fonagy read the book, and he said, Kate, there is not a single sentence of judgment or patronizing, or, he was really, and I thought, I've done my job, because he was looking for that, because he knows the parents that he's working with, if they sense that I am not on board and collaborative and going, look, guys, let's just all hold hands here, because it's a really hard job. And here's what I've learned. And the other thing that I wanted to do was, and what made sense to me, I do think in a very sort of, it's a bit more visual way, I guess. I felt that if I can explain the brain in a using animals, which I'm sure we'll get to, but sort of 3 animals and a tree, it takes away the sort of personal nature of my child is being difficult, and rather looking at our children going, oh, look at that little baboon beating his chest, like he's just showing me right now that this is really important to him. And because that helped me, and it helps. And I think that element of, when you use the example where I'd had this bunion operation, which made me giggle, because I'm like, that's my age, bunion operation, which left me incapacitated. And then my son was running around upstairs, in that sort of typical, really high alert baboon behavior. And in that instant, my own baboon goes up, and I'm like, oh God, my friend's watching, and I feel judged, and I'm writing this book, and she's going to think my children are really, and I explain that in the book, how our stress response goes up. And then we're operating from that baboon place where we're like, will you stop running? And that's not the mum I want to be. And it's not the parent I'm sure any of us want to be. So, but in that moment, instead of shouting, I can kind of go, oh, okay, hang on a moment. It's not him. Why is he running around? He doesn't normally do that at this time of night. Do you know what? I wonder whether he's been a bit worried. It's all a bit odd. I've had to bring my friend in as a bit of an emergency because I got back late from the hospital. Mum's now incapacitated. I can't look after him properly. There's a strange lady that he hasn't really met that many times now trying to help him with, and oh, let's just think about that, shall we, for a second? Because maybe it's his stress response and he's needing to exorcise that. And I can now help him, and I can wise owl it, and I can hobble up the stairs and kind of go, sweetheart, are you, and what we did in that situation was we all then got into bed, me and Clemency and Wilbur, and we sat there. And I said, gosh, you look like you've had really big feelings today. They're all coming out all over the place. I don't make my children laugh because it takes the stress away. And the first thing he said was, actually, I need to sort of find the book because there was a question, and he said to me, it was about the operation. He said, oh, why did they need you to be? And it was something around why were you away today, basically. And that was it right there in that exchange, that he'd been all day probably holding in, where's mummy? Mummy comes back hobbling through the door, you know, she's incapacitated, she can't actually sort of do much with Wilbur, he's got a strange lady in the house, daddy's away, you know, and it all just spills out. And that's quite simple. And in that moment, if I acknowledge that, oh gosh, darling, were you missing mummy today? Mummy really missed you. I was curled up at this smelly old hospital, you wouldn't believe it. And then he's looking at my toe saying, does it hurt, mummy? And all that conversation was around that toe. And then I felt him physically relax as we discussed it. And then Clemency came in, and then we all sang a song. And there was this real, in the darkness, and there was a real element and a sense for me of, that's the sort of what it would have been like in traditional communities. We would have had, the men would have gone out on the hunt, and they would have come back really high, sort of adrenaline and everything, and then everyone would have come together. There would have been a mourning and a loss if somebody was hurt, or there would be sort of a celebration of the animal that would have been killed. And then everybody would have come together and sang and exorcised all that stress of the sort of high stress of the hunt. Does that make sense? And it just, I'm trying to relate a lot of that and just kind of go, we know this stuff. Our traditional communities have known how to live and to sort of get rid of our grief in a really healthy way, but and our stress in a really healthy way, but we've sort of lost that. And that's why our children pick up on it, and that's why they behave very often in those situations in the way that they do.
Yeah, it's a lovely example. And I mean, a lot of the people, if not all of the people listening to my podcast normally, although I may get different listeners because might want to Google you and they'll find you on this podcast, but they tend to be very knowledgeable around the science, so around the brain, how bit of basic neuroscience, maybe even some epigenetics, certainly child development, those kind of aspects, because they're working with more complexity or living with more complexity. And what I think was really interesting about your book is you wanted to take something that tends to sit in those areas and make it mainstream. And I think you achieved that. And I did have a little look at your reviews actually on Amazon, and somebody moaned about, because you've got to have some reviews that don't get you because that's life, that it was too simple and it was a bit patronizing. But actually, it's, if you know, when you write, you have to really understand what it is you're trying to do and who your audience are going to be. And I think you did it very, very well, actually, because what you did was you took something that tends to sit in fostering, in adoption, in social work, in special educational needs, in all of those areas, and you turned it into something that makes a difference for everybody. And I think that is quite genius. So really good job there. What I was thinking about while you were talking actually was, because I work around complexity and have lived much complexity, I was thinking about those moments that you described just so beautifully there, and how difficult they can be to access and to get into if, for example, you are living with food poverty, if you don't have any relational support, you live with relational poverty, if you are living in a community where you don't know anyone, you know, all of those kind of things that are disruptors. So you wake up every day, you want to do your best, you understand the science, you're really focused on wanting to do everything. And I know so many parents like that, and there are just so many difficulties around them that actually being able to do that is really hard.
Really hard. And so I think the first thing that I wanted to convey, and thank you for that, because it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think that simplicity is exactly what I was going for. Because it's interesting. Obviously, we see things often not as they are, but as we are. So I think if we feel that something might be patronizing, actually somebody else goes, oh, well, thank you very much. That's really simple.
That's one of my quotes that I always use in training. We see things as we are, not as they are.
Yeah. And so I think, you know, most people do get it, because it was designed with that purity of intent to say, there is no blame or shame in parenting, right? We're all trying to do our best, and also to encourage whoever reads it or whoever is sort of discussing it, is to be honest around those conversations, because the first step has to be in reaching and asking for help. Because as I say in the book, it didn't used to be this hard. It is hard now, because coming back to that nuclear family point, the ratio would have been, I spoke to John Bowlby's son, Richard Bowlby, and he said, Kate, as part of my research, and he said, Kate, he said, it would have been at one time the ratio in a traditional community that one child would have had 19 other adults or older children, responsible children, but people who they trusted, who they knew, reaching out for them in any given day. So that still enabled mum and dad to be off doing what they were doing and coming back and referencing, but that child would have had that sense of safety. Now we have very often one mum and maybe 2 or 3. So the ratio is 1 to 3. You kind of go, that's why it's hard. It isn't meant to be. So I think often what I really wanted was for parents not to be beating themselves up and thinking, gosh, I'm a bad parent, or, oh my goodness, what's wrong with my child? But rather, what's going on for them right now, and also what's going on for me. I'm stressed, I'm hungry, I don't know where the next piece of bread is going to come from, just all the sort of other challenges. Come to a place of thinking, okay, well, firstly, to make it simple for them to sort of see their children, brings to mind a conversation with one mum that I was working with at one of the charities, and we were talking about children hitting. And with this enormous sort of almost not even looking at me, she said, my son's been hitting the baby. And there was such a great sense of awfulness around it, that, gosh, my son must be so awful that he's actually hitting my baby on the head. And I said, of course he is. And she looked at me and I said, because new baby's just come into the house. Who did he have before that? She said, me. And what's happened now? He's got to share you with this thing, because he can't comprehend. He's really, really young. He can't comprehend that this is a baby, a new being, a new life. He's just really, really cross. And that's a survival mechanism. This baby is now taking away a fundamental resource of comfort and time with mummy. So he's going to be cross, and actually at the age of 3 he can't show his feelings in any other way than these big feelings, that sort of behavior with the fist, because there's not as much emotional regulation going on and inner regulation. And I said, my son does that. He hits his sister. We're working on it, but I'm working. So together we sat, and as soon as I said, yeah, my son, that's how he's been expressing. He's 3.5, and so then together we spoke about what we do. And I speak about it in the book in terms of using pillow power, in terms of understanding that first and foremost, that our children are not bad or evil, in their behavior. They're acting out how they're feeling. So then we can help them with that. And then we can start encouraging and helping that child to develop using, all the sort of responses in the book, but to actually develop and to graduate from using their fists. First of all, is you cannot hit your sister. That's a boundary. You can't hit me, but I see you're really, really cross. And you look like you've got stuff in there you really want to. And I said to Will, and I said, could you hit anything else? And he went, pillow. And I went, and I'm thinking, fantastic. So I'm holding a pillow up, and then, go on, give it all you've got, and punching this pillow. And then, of course, you end up laughing because it's also sort of becomes really silly. And then we graduate to then using his words. So now he'll come and say, I'm really cross because Clemency's just taken my book. And I'm like, okay, fine, mummy can come and deal with that. That's what we want. But unless I understood that, unless someone had helped me to understand that, I'd be forever thinking, my God, I've failed as a parent. I've got a really violent son. He's going to grow up to be a really violent teenager. Oh my God, I would catastrophize. And then that would impact on my relationship with my son. And all of that you don't need on top of trying to put food on the table. So I just wanted to try to make that as simple as I possibly could, as in helping parents to understand their children in a way that made life easier for them, that they could cut through the tantrums and cut through the sort of the big emotional. I don't really like using tantrums and meltdowns. I've got to find different words. Perhaps you can help me with that, but the sort of the big behavior, If that's not a problem, if I'm not having to firefight that, then I can focus on all the other stuff. And also in the book throughout, and I end up with the last chapter really talking about how parents can help themselves, because if we're not full in our emotional cup, then, you know, forget it, basically. So I put a lot in there about reaching out and asking for help. And I quoted Rene, who is a dad whose wife died when his children were very young, and he spoke about going to gingerbread club and about the sort of stigma that he felt as this really big black guy coming into a sort of a rather this is him putting it in the book, you know, coming into a rather more sort of genteel London sort of club, and he said all the women were looking at me, and he said I had to really swallow my feelings of I don't belong here, but I was so desperate I needed them. And he said they're now some of my best friends, but he said I had to get to the point of being on my knees to actually reach out and say I'm not coping. And I want to have a conversation. That's why I'm doing these podcasts and speaking to people like you and all the work that you're doing, to say we're all in it together. Let's form a grassroots, you know, movement if we can, and just say, look, we might not be supported as much as we like sort of in that macro society, but together we can make a difference. And that exchange I had with that mom, with our sons, I know helped me, help her.
And I think, you know, I mean, I'm always on a mission to expand that circle, that web, that relational wealth. I mean, I think what's really interesting to me when I reflect back on my parenting was around having no idea that I was supposed to ask for help.
Yeah.
So even below the layer of accessing help is actually, you're not supposed to be able to do this on your own. And unfortunately, I think a trauma response is very much about trying to do everything yourself and not asking for help, because of course those needs haven't been met. There isn't the network, because you might have a very fragmented childhood, so you've moved around a lot, and all of those things. I think that would be, for me, a regret, and something that I speak a lot about when I'm out talking and training and doing my work, is we're not supposed to be doing this on our own.
Yeah.
We're not supposed to be doing this on our own. We need each other. And those groups that you talk about, you know, that you just mentioned there, I mean, they can feel really intimidating. And really difficult to access. And I'd found myself in a quite affluent part of London with no affluence whatsoever, as a full-time working, almost single parent, going to these groups, trying to dip in and dip out, and having absolutely no meeting place. And it reminded me of some of the young mums I was working with at the time. How do those young mums, you know, access when they feel intimidated by more mature mums? I mean, I was, as I said, 26 and 29, and where I lived, I was a young mum. You know, I was a young mum in that area, because they were all people who had quite high flying careers. I knew they'd had high flying careers because when I went into the PTA, I came across all these professional parents, you know, who used to like head up Vodafone or something. And I just was like, oh my God, get me out of here. And I never went back. I just never went back. It was just too awful. No offense to anyone who's listening from that time. I'm sure I don't mean you, obviously. And I think it's those kind of things that we can really work together on, you know, as women at a certain point in our life, forming that wisdom circle. Actually, I was thinking this morning, when you don't have access to that wisdom circle, where are the mechanisms in society to tap into that for younger women? Where are those mechanisms? Because I don't think we have them. So if you're...
We don't. No, you're right. And that's what I've been, and in fact, I'm working on now, funnily enough, and that's why I use the baobab tree, because the baobab tree in Africa is the tree of wisdom. It's where all the elders would gather, all the children would come to learn and have that wisdom. So it's that wisdom circle that you talk about. It's having a place where people know they can come because there'll be somebody there. And we've come so far removed, haven't we, in our society? We think we're so far advanced, and yet we, to be honest, have regressed and forgotten and lost that sort of atavistic sort of need and understanding that we need each other. Yeah. So amen to that in terms of creating a wisdom circle. And I'm
Let's
sure
do
we
it,
can,
Kate.
well, literally it's happening, and all we need is for everybody together in it.
Yeah.
So we can discuss that and pick that up and take it forward. And actually, if my life's work, and I don't say that in sort of any grandiose way, but just as a human being, you know, if I can look back and think, you know, that I was part of that, then that's the best thing that we could possibly hope to achieve with our lives, right? And going back to that legacy thing, there won't be a parent, I think, as you say, who wouldn't wish to go back. And I think that understanding, I spoke to two mums recently, because this is the other thing, I need to expand it, because at the moment I'm a lot on sort of Instagram, where I've got mums who are reaching out. One mum who just adopted and said that she was feeling she didn't feel that she'd bonded with her. Anyway, we spoke, and I said, and who have you spoken to about this? And she said, no one, because I've adopted and I'll be judged. And I said, please try, because you know what? They're going to be the best people, because they'll have been through this. And if they think you're coping, they're not going to, you know, because you sound like you're an amazing mom. You know, we talked quite a lot, and I said, you sound incredible. And anyway, she wrote back and she went, I've told everybody, and it's amazing. Everyone's been so helpful, and the bond is back, and da, 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 da. And I'm like, wow, she would have been sitting on her own with this for goodness knows how long. And it makes you want to weep. And so I forgot my point, but just really, I think just to open that up and to say that that's the place to start. Oh, I know, it's the thinking of you know, the internal, because even I hadn't really appreciated just how much our external experience impacts on brain development in our babies. And again, not to scare everybody, but to say in a way of, actually, we can always repair that. That's what I also want. And you'll know all about rupture and repair. And when we understand that our brains are still developing, your brain, my brain, are still sort of fizzing and, you know, sort of lovely, and, you know, we can still have 90-year-olds going into therapy. And so our brains are wonderfully sort of adaptable, and they can change and everything. So we must never forget that actually we're all going to mess up in some way or another. But if our children, especially when our children are really, really young, that's the time when we can say, okay, do you know what? I had a really, really horrific pregnancy. I had this going on. I had that. I now see that I've got a baby who is, if we understand it, we can see that if we've got a baby who's more distressed maybe than other babies, we don't look and think, well, there's something wrong with it. We can just go, do you know what? I wonder if that little lizard brain needs a lot more soothing, because when that lizard brain was inside and developing, it wasn't getting the smoothest ride. So now, when we understand that, there's no blame or shame in that, it's just that's science, right? So that brain was developing at a time of great pressure and stress for mum, so it will have developed with sort of a little bit more hypersensitive. Well, okay, then I can understand that if my baby's crying more than everybody else's, it's not because there's something wrong with me or my baby, that maybe I just need to do a bit more lizard soothing. And you know, you'll understand what I mean by that reading the book, but essentially it's that very reptilian part of the brain that's the really ancient part of the brain that is involved in the fight, flight, freeze response, but also our breathing, eating, sleeping. So if the lizard is sort of constantly on red alert, we're inside mummy's inside mum, and the environment's a lot more stressed, then hey presto, you're going to have a baby whose little lizard brain, that part of the brain that was the first to develop, is also going to be a little bit more jittery. But there's so much that we understand now about soothing that, and anything pattern, repetitive and rhythmic. If you look at the work of Dr. Bruce Perry, and I've interviewed him at length, he's all in the book, anything pattern, repetitive, rhythmic soothes that part of the brain that brings us back to balance. It brings us back to the balance as adults, which is why we love, whether it's knitting, running, walking, humming, drumming, all those lovely things, but it can also help our babies and our children. So there are solutions, is what I'm trying to say, and it's never, ever, ever too late. So if we're sitting there thinking, oh gosh, I've got a 7-year-old who's really anxious and I see this behavior, that's okay. We can resolve that. And again, reaching out and asking for help and finding the right resources and actually saying, this is my right, right? I had a difficult time. It's my right.
Yeah, but I think there is one missing piece of the jigsaw for me, and that is we really, really understand now the optimum conditions for the developing baby. Yet we still are not activist enough to ensure that that message is very clear to dads, that that message is very clear to workplaces, that that message should show up in policy. So we have child-centered policy and governmental commitment to understanding what those optimum conditions are and seeing that as a long game. We are not there yet. And that I find upsetting, because if we are going to talk about what the optimum conditions are for a baby to develop inside a woman, then we have to make sure that the men in her life understand what that woman needs then, and are able to support her, because that men are still very invisible in this conversation, and we are not where we need to be with that yet. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's because women, no, you see, women are not dominating this conversation. I've been to enough conferences, I've stood on enough platforms. Men dominate this conversation academically, and women go and do the work. And I'm being really general. That needs to shift. That needs to shift. Yeah, that's where I'd like us to go next. And I think we are in a revolution in so many different ways, but we are in a very particular revolution, the Women Over 50s Brigade. There is a lot of noise out there that we just did not have before. We did not have those spaces and places.
Yeah, and capacity. I mean, I'm still in it, to be honest with you. Sometimes, you know, I mean, gosh, I'd be out there doing even more, but it'd be deeply ironic if I was neglecting my own kids in that, you know, given that mine are, when I listen to you say yours are like 25, and I'm like, oh my God, we're the same age, and I've got a 7-year-old. So I'm still very much in the thick of it, and a very present mum, and so that's my sort of juggle. But equally, I do get fired up the same as you, and I mean, I'd like to open it up really. I think I hear what you're saying, and you're dealing with that sort of policy side of things a lot more than I. Although at the moment I'm working very closely, so with the Duchess of Cambridge, who is equally as passionate about this, with, as I say, people like Professor Peter Fonagy, Dr. Bruce Perry. So I probably would say we open it up, and all we have to do, because interestingly, actually, Lisa, is I've had loads of dads come back to me having read the book, or having been told that they've got to read the book. And it's interesting. And I wonder, and I'm only wondering, and I think because I've got a military husband who also had a very sort of challenged childhood, but with that military mindset of like, if you let them get away with this now, he doesn't talk like that, but you know, he's from Hartlepool and he's my love of my life, but I can't even anyway go near trying to mimic him. But anyway, you know, if we do that now, you know, this sort of soft approach as what would have been traditionally sort of you know, we're going to create a rod for our own back, and we're going to have a teenager who never listens to us. That was kind of, I think, his fear underneath. When he watched and saw the difference between confrontation and forcing, so I talk about Wilbur being in the bath one day and you know, having a massive outburst, and I heard this sort of great big hullabaloo, ran upstairs thinking, God, this doesn't happen very often, you know, kind of what is going on, and I'm like, get out of the bath, you know. So his baboon was up and out of the gates. Wilbur was, no, I'm not, and then it's like, oh, okay. So, and then, you know, okay, I'm just going to step in here. And then actually Wilbur was really distressed. I'm going off on piece again, I'm sorry, but Wilbur was really distressed, and it turned out that it was something else entirely. And I was able to get him out of the bath in what felt like an eternity, because he was really distressed, and I was really worried that he was going to hurt himself. So my baboon was having to I'm having to sort of, because, you know, that's the bit of our brains that kicks off when we're afraid. And at that point, I think Mike and I were afraid he was going to hurt himself in the bath. And it turned out something had happened earlier in the day, a really big thing had happened earlier in the day. And of course, it's spilling out at nighttime. I was able to calm him and get him out of the bath and sit with me and hold him in a big sort of fluffy towel and rock him backwards and forwards while he told me about that experience. And we resolved it, you know, and I explain it in detail in the book. It actually involves Santa Claus. So if it goes out anywhere near Christmas, you might want to have a look at that. But anyway, too long to go into now. And Mike stood outside and he said, my God, he said, it would have taken me probably 2 hours, I would have probably lifted him out of the bath using more sort of force than I wanted to, but because I was scared that he was going to hurt himself, like fall back and hit his head. I would have taken him to the bedroom. He'd have been kicking and screaming. I'd have been screaming, you know, and he said that would have, he's like, then I would have felt absolutely awful for the rest of the night and just felt like a failure and an awful dad. And he said, you did it in a match. He said, it would have taken me 2 hours. You've done it in 2 minutes. And that was it. And now it's this heaven when I walk past the bedroom or whatever, and he'll be sort of, and, you know, using the sort of language, I call it SAS, you know, sort of inspired by him, sort of this sort of say what you see, acknowledge, soothe. And he does that. And he's just, yeah. So, and I'm finding that other dads, and I think it's because of the science. I think it's because I go in, I know it's because, and that's one of the main reasons for doing it, because it's not my opinion. All right. This book is not my opinion. It's full of rich, hefty science that has been informed by decades and decades of research, and Suzanne Zedek and other incredible people doing incredible work, who were so instrumental for the book coming to life, because I wanted to highlight their work and cheerlead them and say, look, this is not my opinion. This is what people have been finding. This is the people that have been doing this work for decades, for their lifetimes. And I'm just going to explain it in a way that makes sense to me. And I think because of that roots in science, there's a lot of dads who might have, and I don't want to generalize as well, but let's say people, but there's a lot of dads who might have thought, oh God, it's just some sort of, you know, softly approach. Whereas they're going, oh, right, there's right, okay, so the amygdala and sort of the prefrontal cortex, and yeah, I mean, I don't use that language. I use the language of the animals, but that's what we're talking about. And I think for them, it makes it easier to accept that there is a different process, there is a different way of working with our children than perhaps we might have been led to believe. And I think it also, a lot of dads have said to me, like Joe Wicks is one who says the book's changed his life. And he said to me, because he was parented in a way, his dad, as he's been very public about, was a heroin addict, and there was a lot of shouting in the family, a lot of aggression. And he's very open about that. And he said, Kate, this book has changed my life, because I was becoming the adult child, I am the adult child, you know, who was then shouting at my own children, and that trauma response that we all recognize. And in fact, Lisa, I'm going to have to talk to you about book 2, because book 2, I want to start with us, because I realize from all the feedback I'm getting and from my own experience that it's not often our children's behavior, it's what their behavior triggers in us. Does that make sense? So if we've had trauma, if we are hypersensitive to certain things, whether it's noise or whether it's violence in inverted commas, if a child hits another child, or a child that is resistant or whatever, it can trigger in us something that then we respond in a baboon way as opposed to a wise owl way. And I think when we can start working with that, we kind of go, oh, right, actually, it's not them, it's actually me. I'm tired, I'm scared, I'm actually worried about what's going on in the world and whether I've got enough food on the table. That's my stuff. I can work with that. I can go and have a cup of tea with a friend and actually offload that. I'm not going to offload that on my kids.
And that's the deep work. That's actually the deep work.
Yes.
And that deepening knowledge and understanding about our responses and what's coming up for us, and also the things that we're trying to protect our children from, that is actually our own inner child.
Yeah.
So the things we're trying to ensure that our children don't have to deal with, by accident, we can give them all sorts of other things to deal with. But listen, Kate, we've actually been speaking for nearly an hour, and it feels like 5 minutes. We're clearly in our favorite subject, and I was thinking while you were talking, I really should call the podcast "I Don't Make This Stuff Up," you know.
Yes.
Because the amount of times I say that, when I sometimes get someone questions something in a training session, and I say, I don't make this stuff up, you know, like it's not just come out of the top of my head.
Yeah.
But I had so many other questions, but you know what, we might just have to do this again. So
yeah, we'll do a part 2. You know what I'd love to do is to get questions from your listeners, and that would be quite nice. We could cover some of that off. I'd love
Brilliant.
to do that, because it's really good for me. I'm always seeking feedback because I have my experience. I do talk to a lot of parents, you know, it's not all about me in this book, but I wanted to use my own personal experience because I think that's the most honest and authentic way. You know, there's a lot of books that are written by people sometimes if they don't even have kids, for example. And I think actually if you know that someone's got lived experience, and in fact not just living it but living as they're writing, you know, that it's a very rich. And I wanted just to sort of say, look, you know, if you're anything like me, this is kind of, you know, mortification at the school gate or whatever it is. So I am very honest, but for the next book, as my children get older, in honor of, you know, to sort of honor them, but I'm always really keen to hear people's experience and what they find most difficult, and actually tips and tricks that they find really good. I'm now training as a child therapist. I don't know whether you know, but so I'll, you know, in that my training, we get a lot. I get just gorgeous, you know, sort of tips, and so I'm always sort of referencing people saying, well, thank you for that, I love that, you know, and putting that in the next book.
I will invite people to make comment, and we will also, this will undoubtedly make some noise on Twitter, so you can directly respond to people as well, which would be great. But listen, thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, really, thank you for having me.
Really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you.
See you.